The gavel cracked, a sound like a dry bone snapping. "In this courtroom we speak the King's English, young lady, or at least we try to." Judge Arthur Galloway leaned over the bench, his face a mask of smug condescension. The courtroom, already thick with tension, sucked in a collective breath. A bailiff snickered. Keisha Washington, 19 years old and shaking in her best blazer, stood frozen at the podium. The judge had not just dismissed her argument. He had dismissed her. Her voice, her home, her very existence. He had mocked her accent, and the silence that followed was louder than a bomb. Courtroom 407 of the Juanita Kid, Stout Center for Criminal Justice in Philadelphia, was a study in beige oppression. The walls were a sickly pale yellow, the color of old office files. The fluorescent lights hummed with a migraine-inducing frequency, casting a flat, unforgiving glare on the worn linoleum floors and the heavy, dark wood benches. The air itself was a stale cocktail of floor wax, anxiety, and the faint, unsettling smell of the holding cell disinfectant from the floor below. It was a room designed not for justice, but for processing. A room that told you, from the moment you entered, that you were a number, a case file, a problem to be dealt with. Keisha Washington stood at the defense podium. It was technically the respondent podium in this civil hearing, but it felt like the defense. Her knuckles were white where she gripped its edges. She was 19, a sophomore at UPenn. But in this room, she felt 12 years old, dressed in her mother's oversized clothes. The blazer, a sharp navy blue find from the Second Ave thrift store on Gray's Ferry Avenue, had been a confidence purchase. She'd meticulously ironed her white blouse this morning at 5 a.m., but now she could feel a single drop of sweat rolling slowly from her hairline down her temple, and she prayed it wasn't visible. This was Case 3B901, Gray's Ferry Community Coalition versus Apex Logistics Solutions. On the surface, it was a dry-as-dust zoning appeal. To Keisha, it was a matter of life and death. Apex, a faceless Goliath of a corporation, wanted to build a massive 24/7 last-mile warehouse. They called it community investment. Keisha, who had read the 800-page environmental impact report, knew what it really was. It was 300 diesel trucks a day, idling, rumbling, and spewing PM 2.5 particulates onto the streets where her little brother Darius played. It was a poison cloud, settling over the one playground they had left, right next to the elementary school. For the last 40 minutes, she had listened to Mr. Vance, the Apex lawyer. He was a tall man in a suit that cost more than her grandmother's monthly mortgage. He spoke in smooth, anesthetizing tones about job creation, supply chain efficiency, and negligible environmental impact. He used charts with bright, misleading colors. Then, the clerk had called her name. Keisha Washington, for the Gray's Ferry Community Coalition. Her walk to the podium had felt like wading through wet cement. Now she was here, and presiding over it all was Judge Arthur J. Galloway. Galloway was a relic of old Philadelphia, a mainline aristocrat with watery blue eyes, skin like pink tissue paper, and a family name that was carved onto university buildings. He was known in the public interest world as Gavel Galloway, a man who believed community action suits were a personal annoyance and a waste of his valuable time. He'd been sighing, tapping his pen, and looking at the clock over Keisha's head since she'd started. He hadn't made eye contact once. "Your Honor," Keisha had begun, her voice shaking only a little. "My name is Keisha Washington. I live on 30th and Tasker, 4 blocks from the proposed site. I'm here representing the coalition, and we ain't been heard." She saw Vance, the Apex lawyer, hide a smile behind his hand. "This ain't about supply chain efficiency, Your Honor. This is about our kids. We already got the highest asthma rates in the city. My own brother Darius, he carries 2 inhalers, and y'all are talking about putting 300 trucks a day in his backyard. That ain't development. That's an attack. That's a poison pill for our whole neighborhood." Her voice had grown stronger as she spoke. The tremor was gone, replaced by the righteous, rolling cadence of her home. The voice of her grandmother, Nana May. The voice of her block. It was authentic. It was real. And it was, apparently, offensive. Judge Galloway, who had been examining his cuticles, suddenly looked up. He held up a manicured hand, a signal for her to stop. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, but it sliced through her sentence like a razor. Keisha stopped. "Sir? Your Honor? I don't follow that, young lady." Galloway leaned forward, peering at her over the top of his half-moon glasses as if she were a particularly confusing microbe. "I'm afraid I simply cannot comprehend that dialect. Ain't. Y'all. Representin'. It's imprecise. It's gutter." The last word was barely a whisper, but it landed like a physical blow. Keisha's blood ran cold. He had not just misunderstood her. He had insulted her. He had done it on purpose. I don't understand, Your Honor," she stammered, the heat rising in her cheeks. "It's a simple matter of decorum," Galloway said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. He looked around, as if sharing a private, sophisticated joke with the other educated people in the room. The court stenographer, a middle-aged woman named Jan, looked down at her keyboard, her face frozen. The bailiff by the door coughed, a sound suspiciously like a snicker. Mr. Vance, the apex lawyer, was now smiling openly, a thin, cruel slash. "This is the Juanita Kidd Stout Center, Ms. Washington, a place of history, of precedent, of the law, not a street corner." He picked up his gavel, tapping it lightly, a teacher rapping a ruler on a disobedient student's desk. "In this courtroom we speak the King's English, young lady, or at least we try to." Crack. The gavel came down, sharp and final, and that was when the silence hit. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Every molecule of air and sound and hope seemed to be sucked out of the room. Keisha felt the burn of 1,000 invisible eyes. She felt the weight of the robe, the bench, the flag, the entire crushing, beige-colored system, all pointing at her, laughing. He was right. She didn't belong here. She was just a girl from Gray's Ferry in a thrift store blazer, trying to speak a language they had no interest in hearing. In that moment, as the judge leaned back, satisfied with his small, cruel victory, something in Keisha Washington broke, and something else, something cold and hard and forged in the fires of a Philadelphia winter, clicked into place. The voice Judge Galloway had mocked was not born in a vacuum. It was forged. It was forged on the stoops of Tasker Street, in the call and response of the Double Dutch ropes. It was the voice of her grandmother, Nana May Washington, a woman who had come up from South Carolina with nothing but a bus ticket and a spine of steel. Nana May's voice was a deep, melodic drawl that held generations of wisdom. "Your voice is your home, baby," she'd tell Keisha, sitting on their small porch, shelling peas into a metal bowl. "The way you talk, that's your key. It proves where you're from. Don't let nobody make you ashamed of the key. You just learn what doors it opens. And if it don't open the door you want, you build a new door." It was the voice of her little brother, Darius. He was 9, small for his age, with eyes that held the universe. He also had lungs that betrayed him, a severe, brittle asthma that was a constant, wheezing soundtrack to their lives. His last attack, 2 months ago, had been a bad one. Keisha had been the one to find him on the playground, his face a terrifying shade of blue, his small hands clutching his chest. She had been the one to ride in the ambulance, screaming at the driver to go faster. The emergency room doctor at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, had been blunt. "It's the air quality. He's a frequent flyer. You live in 19146. What do you expect?" That was the night Keisha had stopped being a concerned resident and become a warrior. That was the night this whole thing had really started. She wasn't just a black teen. She was Keisha Washington, 19 years old, a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania on a full-ride mayor's scholarship. She was pre-law. She was ranked #1 in her program. She wasn't just in college, she was a legal prodigy, a name whispered in the halls of Penn Law as one to watch. When she'd first seen the zoning notice for the Apex warehouse tacked to a telephone pole, she'd done what she'd been trained to do. She'd gone to the library. She'd downloaded the 800-page proposal. And she had read it. All of it. The dense, boring, impenetrable legalese. The endless charts and appendices. She'd read it with a highlighter in one hand and a legal dictionary in the other, while Darius slept with his breathing treatment mask on. And she'd found it. Buried in Appendix F, page 482. A single line of data. A discrepancy so small, yet so glaring, it was like a typo in the word God. It was a lie. A clear, provable, calculated lie. She'd taken her findings to Dr. Elaine Castor, her faculty advisor at Penn Law. Dr. Castor, a sharp woman who had argued before the Supreme Court, had looked at Keisha's research, then at Keisha, and had done a very rare thing. She'd smiled. "Well, Ms. Washington," she'd said, "you've got them." Dr. Castor had then made a call. "I'm putting you in touch with the Public Interest Law Center. You're ready." For the last 6 months, Keisha had been a Thurgood Marshall Fellow at the center. It was a hidden identity of sorts. She wasn't just a teen activist. She was a student clerk, a legal researcher with access to the full, terrifying power of the public interest bar. She had spent her fellowship building this case. She had practiced her speech for weeks. She'd stood in front of her mirror trying to iron out the ain'ts and y'alls. She'd tried to sound like the lawyers on Law and Order, but Nana May had found her, pacing the living room at 2 a.m. "Baby, what you doing?" I sound uneducated, Nana," Keisha had whispered, the words tasting like acid. Nana May had taken her face in her hands. "You are the smartest person I know. You are the voice of this place. You go down there and you speak from your heart. You speak in our language. If they ain't smart enough to understand you, that's their failure, not yours. You plant your words, Keisha. You hear me? Plant 'em." And so she had. She had walked into that courtroom with her binder full of facts and her heart full of her grandmother's words. She had planted them, and this old, white man in a black robe had just tried to poison the soil. Back in the courtroom, the silence still rang. Keisha stood at the podium, the judge's words, gutter, street corner, King's English, echoing in her ears. He was shuffling his papers, satisfied, ready to move on. He had dismissed her. "They will underestimate you," Dr. Castor's voice echoed in her memory. "That is your weapon. Use it." She thought about Darius's blue face. She thought about Nana May's key. She thought about Appendix F, page 482. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving a cold, prickling numbness. The trap was set. If she yelled, she was the angry black woman. If she cried, she was the hysterical girl. If she walked away, she was the ignorant teen he'd already decided she was. It was a perfect trap. And Keisha Washington, in a thrift store blazer, with the voice of her grandmother in her heart, decided to spring it. The silence in courtroom 407 was a living thing. It was heavy, suffocating. Judge Galloway, having delivered his rebuke, was now pointedly ignoring Keisha. He peered down at his docket, his face a mask of judicial boredom, a clear signal that her time was over. "Now," he said to the room at large, "if the community," he let the word hang, heavy with disdain, "has no articulate objections, I am prepared to move on to the motion to accept the petitioner's environmental report. Mr. Vance?" Mr. Vance, the Apex lawyer, stood up, smoothing the front of his vest. He was a shark that smelled blood. "Thank you, Your Honor. We believe the report speaks for itself. It is comprehensive, thorough, and clearly demonstrates. Your Honor, the voice was quiet. It was not a shout. It was a low, level, perfectly controlled sound. It was Keisha. Galloway's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. He was not used to being interrupted, especially not by someone he had just summarily dismissed. "What is it now, Ms. Washington?" he snapped, his patience, a thin veneer at the best of times, visibly gone. "I thought I had made myself clear." "You did, sir," Keisha said. Her hands were still on the podium, but they were no longer gripping it for dear life. They were resting on it. From the back left corner of the gallery, a man watched. He was the only other black person in the room, besides Keisha and the bailiff. He was in his late 50s, wearing an immaculate, razor-sharp Brioni suit, the kind that cost more than a car. He sat alone in the last pew, a picture of stillness. He had been observing the hearing, his face impassive. Now, a flicker of something, interest, perhaps, crossed his features. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, not at Keisha, but to himself. Keisha didn't see him. All her focus was on the man in the robe. "You said you couldn't comprehend my dialect, Your Honor," Keisha continued, her voice still quiet. But now it was different. The home was still there, the rhythm of her block, but it was now underpinned by something else. A cold, hard, clarifying anger. "You said you wanted the King's English," Galloway sneered. "And I'm still waiting. Cat got your vernacular?" The bailiff snickered again. Mr. Vance sat down, enjoying the show. "No, sir," Keisha said. She took a slow, deliberate breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The shaking in her legs stopped. "I was just considering your words, and I was considering my own." She then did something that broke the room's hypnosis. She reached down, not to her canvas tote bag, but to the floor beside her. She retrieved a heavy, battered leather briefcase. It was the kind old-school lawyers used, with brass latches. It had been a gift from Dr. Castor. She placed the briefcase on the podium. The thud of the leather on the wood was a small, definitive sound. Then she clicked the latches. Snick, snick. In the dead silence of the courtroom, the sounds were as loud as cannon fire. Galloway stared. Vance stared. The stenographer, Jan, who had been looking at Keisha with a pained, sympathetic expression, now looked at her with confusion. Keisha opened the briefcase. It was not full of pamphlets or petitions. It was full of documents. Thick, neatly tabbed, bound legal briefs. "You seem to be under a number of misapprehensions, Your Honor," Keisha said, her voice rising in volume, not in pitch. It was a command, not a plea. "Let's clear 'em up." Galloway's face, which had been a smug pink, began to mottle. "Young lady, you are bordering on contempt. My name," she said, cutting him off, "is Keisha Washington. I am the founder and lead coordinator of the Grays Ferry Community Coalition, which, as of August 1st, is a registered 501c3 non-profit organization and the primary respondent in this case. Our legal standing was filed with your clerk 6 weeks ago. I have a copy if you misplaced yours." She pulled the first document from the case. Thwack. She placed it on the podium. Mr. Vance, the shark, was no longer smiling. He was, in fact, looking at Keisha with a dawning, horrified recognition. He'd just realized who she was. He had read the coalition's initial filing, a sharp, precise 20-page brief. He had assumed K. Washington was some seasoned, white, environmental lawyer from the ACLU. He had never, in a million years, connected that brief with the black teen in front of him. "Second," Keisha said, her voice gaining power, "I am not just a community member. I am a sophomore, pre-law at the University of Pennsylvania on a full academic scholarship." Galloway's eyes widened, just a fraction. This was not in his script. "And for the past 6 months," Keisha continued, her voice now a ringing indictment, I have been a Thurgood Marshall Fellow in Public Interest Law, clerking for the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia. I am, in effect, acting as student counsel for my own case, under the supervision of the Pennsylvania Bar. She was, in this moment, an officer of his court. And he had just told her she spoke gutter. The transformation was astonishing. The scared teen was gone. In her place was a prosecutor. The thrift store blazer suddenly looked like a suit of armor. The air in the courtroom had changed. The pressure had shifted. It was no longer a judge looking down at a girl. It was a legal fellow addressing a superior. Keisha was no longer at the podium. She was commanding it. "Your Honor," Keisha said, her voice as cold and sharp as the January wind off the Schuylkill River. "You said you were concerned with my language, so let's use yours. The language of the law, the language of facts." She pulled a thick, bound document from her briefcase. This one was tabbed with bright yellow sticky notes. She didn't just place it on the podium. She walked it over to the overhead projector, the one Mr. Vance had used for his misleading charts. She slammed it down and flipped on the light. A page of dense, single-spaced data filled the screen on the wall. "This, Your Honor, is Appendix F, page 482 of the petitioner's Environmental Impact Report. It is the cornerstone of their entire petition. It is the evidence Mr. Vance has been referring to, which claims a negligible impact on air quality in the 19146 zip code." Mr. Vance, the corporate lawyer, stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Objection! Your Honor, she is mischaracterizing the data. This is a complex report. She can't possibly go—" "Sit down, Mr. Vance." The voice didn't come from the judge. It came from Keisha. She hadn't even looked at him. Her eyes were locked on Galloway. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with a calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. "Please instruct counsel to sit down. This is my allotted time." Or was that gutter interruption part of his presentation? Galloway, stunned by the audacity, by the sheer, unadulterated nerve, found himself on the back foot. The entire room was watching him. The stenographer had her fingers poised, waiting for his response. He looked at Vance. He looked at Keisha. He looked at the document on the screen. "Mr. Vance," he mumbled, his voice a low growl. "Sit. Let her finish." Vance sat. His face was pale. "Thank you," Keisha said. She picked up a laser pointer. "As I was saying, this report, it's very thorough. It details particulate matter, ozone levels, and CO2 emissions. It's a beautiful report. Professional. Only one problem." She clicked the pointer, and a thin red dot landed on a single line of data. A string of numbers. "It's fraudulent." A collective gasp went up from the small community section of the gallery, where Nana May sat with two other church members. Vance was on his feet again. "Your Honor, that is slander. It is a baseless, outrageous accusation. I demand she be held in contempt." "Is it baseless, Mr. Vance?" Keisha's voice was a scalpel. "Is it slander if it's true?" She clicked the laser pointer to the top of the page. "This data, which you are trying to pass off as being from Gray's Ferry, Philadelphia County, was collected in Chester County." She let the words hang in the air. "Chester County," she continued, for the benefit of the judge, "is 30 miles away. It is rural. It is farmland. It is not a dense, urban neighborhood already suffering from the emissions of the I-76 corridor. You didn't make a mistake, Mr. Vance. You didn't think we'd check, did you? You thought we were just a bunch of dumb residents from the hood. You thought nobody would read page 482. Her voice dropped, and she looked at him with a pity that was more insulting than any anger. You thought we couldn't read." Vance was white as a sheet. He was grabbing his briefcase. He was looking at the door. "But it's worse than that, Your Honor," Keisha said, turning her attention back to the judge, who now looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. "You see, this isn't just a zoning matter anymore. By submitting a falsified, fraudulent document to this tribunal, Apex Logistics and their counsel, Mr. Vance, have just committed a crime. It's called perjury. It's called conspiracy to commit environmental harm. It's a direct violation of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, as it pertains to the runoff into the Schuylkill River. And, she added, it's a gross violation of the Pennsylvania Rules of Professional Conduct, specifically Rule 3.3, Candor toward the Tribunal. She was, in real time, ending Mr. Vance's career, and she was doing it from memory. The silence that had followed the judge's insult was a vacuum. This silence was a solid object. It was the sound of a power dynamic, an entire social order being inverted in a single, brutal moment. Keisha Washington, the teen from the street corner, was standing in the well of the court, a laser pointer in her hand, having just quoted, from memory, the specific statute and ethical rule that the multi-million-dollar corporation and its high-priced lawyer had broken. Judge Galloway was no longer smug. He was no longer bored. He was, for the first time in what was likely a very long time, afraid. He was a man who had been safely ensconced in the old boy network his entire life, and a 19-year-old girl had just, very calmly and very publicly, called him a biased, prejudiced fool. And even worse, she had done it for the record. He looked at the court stenographer. Jan, who had been looking down, was now staring at Keisha, her fingers flying across the keys, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile on her face. She was getting every single word. Now, see here, Ms. Washington, Galloway sputtered, gripping the arms of his chair. He was trying to re-establish his authority, but his voice was a reedy, panicked thing. You are making very serious accusations. I am, sir, Keisha agreed, and the calmness of her agreement was what made it so devastating. And I have the receipts. She clicked off the projector. She walked back to the podium, back to her briefcase. She was not done. You're correct, Your Honor, she said, her voice now filling the room. It was a voice that needed no microphone. It was the voice of a leader. This is a court of law, and the law has rules. Rules of conduct, for example. She looked directly at the stenographer. For the record, I would like to note the time, 10:32 a.m., and the court's commentary regarding my vernacular and my gutter language. Galloway went from pale to ashen. He was about to be on the record in a judicial conduct review, and he knew it. I believe your words, Keisha continued, her gaze pinning him to his high-backed chair, fall under Canon 2, Rule 2.3 of the Pennsylvania Code of Judicial Conduct. She didn't need to look at a paper. She knew this part by heart. She had rehearsed it. She had prayed she wouldn't have to use it. A judge, she quoted, her voice clear and ringing like a bell, shall perform judicial duties without bias or prejudice. A judge shall not, in the performance of judicial duties, by words or conduct manifest bias or prejudice, including, but not limited to, bias or prejudice based upon race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or socioeconomic status. She let the words hang in the beige, stale air, transforming it. You mocked my accent, Your Honor, she said, her voice now dropping, not in defeat, but in judgment. You called my language gutter. You told me to speak the King's English. Was that not? She asked, and it was a real, terrible question. A manifestation of bias based on race, on ethnicity, on socioeconomic status? The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic tap-tap-tap of the stenographer's keys. How dare you? Galloway whispered. He was beyond sputtering. He was in full-blown apoplectic rage. He was losing control. The script he had written in his head, where the little girl from the hood was shamed into silence, was not just being ignored. It was being ripped to shreds and set on fire in front of him. You, he seethed, are in contempt. You are in contempt of this court. He fumbled for his gavel, his hand shaking so badly he almost missed it. He raised it high, a king about to order an execution. Am I? Keisha asked, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the room. Am I in contempt, sir? She looked at him. She looked at the gavel, trembling in his hand. Or are you? That was it. The final, perfect question. The moment the whole room turned. Keisha had not raised her voice. She had not sworn. She had not cried. She had used his law, his rules, his king's English, and she had hung him with it. The gavel was at the apex of its arc, about to come crashing down. I would strongly advise against that, Your Honor. The new voice was a cello, deep, resonant, and vibrating with an authority that dwarfed everyone in the room, including the judge. The man in the Brioni suit, who had been sitting quietly in the back, was now standing. He was tall, ramrod straight, and he radiated an aura of such intense, concentrated power that the bailiff instinctively straightened his own uniform. He walked down the center aisle. He did not hurry. He moved with the unassailable confidence of a man who bills at $2,000 an hour and has never, in his entire life, lost an argument. He didn't stop at the low wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the court. He unlatched it, walked through it, and came to stand at the counsel table, directly beside Keisha's briefcase. Judge Galloway, his gavel still raised, stared at him, his mouth open. Who in the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The man placed a slim, alligator skin briefcase on the table. "My name," he said, his voice a low, lethal hum, "is Marcus Thorne, Your Honor. I am a senior partner at Deschert, LLP." Galloway's arm, the one holding the gavel, visibly wavered. Deschert, one of the largest, most powerful, and most feared corporate law firms in the world. Its headquarters was a few blocks away, a skyscraper of glass and steel. Marcus Thorne was a legend. He was on the cover of American Lawyer. He was a fixer. "I am also," Thorne continued, "the chairman of the board for the Grays Ferry Community Coalition, and I am acting as Ms. Washington's supervising attorney for her fellowship at the law center." He turned and looked at Keisha, and for the first time, his face broke into a small, brilliant smile. "Though it is abundantly clear," he said, his voice full of pride, "that she does not require one." Galloway's arm fell. The gavel didn't crash. It thudded onto the desk, a weak, defeated sound. His blood had drained from his face. He hadn't just insulted a teen from the hood. He had insulted a pre-law prodigy who was being personally mentored by Marcus Thorne. A man who could, with a single phone call, end his career. Thorne turned his ice-cold gaze back to the judge. "We were prepared, Your Honor, to let Ms. Washington present her findings on the fraudulent report alone. We felt the facts spoke for themselves." His eyes flicked to the stenographer, then back to Galloway. "But your conduct, sir, your explicit, recorded bias, has now made this a separate and more serious matter. We are filing, as of this second," he tapped his alligator briefcase, "a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Board of Pennsylvania. We will be citing Canon 2, Rule 2.3, and we will be demanding your immediate, permanent removal from the bench." This is... "I'm not finished," Thorne said, silencing him. He then turned to Mr. Vance, the apex lawyer, who was trying to become invisible, to melt into the cheap wood of the bench. "And as for you, Mr. Vance," Thorne said, his voice now filled with a predatory glee, "submitting a fraudulent report to a tribunal. Tusk, that's not just an ethics violation. That's disbarment territory. My associates are already drafting the complaint. I hope your malpractice insurance is paid up." Vance, who was a partner at his firm, a small local outfit, looked like he was going to be physically ill. He stood up, grabbed his bags, and, without a word to the judge, he turned and fled the courtroom. He literally ran. This hearing is postponed," Galloway yelled, standing up, his own chair screeching back. "This hearing is suspended." "Oh, no, sir," Marcus Thorne said, holding up a hand. "It's not. You, Your Honor, maybe." He gestured to the door. A woman had entered. A senior, no-nonsense judge. Judge Maria Sanchez, the presiding judge of the Civil Division. She had clearly been called. "Arthur," she said, her voice like steel. "My chambers, now." Galloway, his face gray, his robes looking like a Halloween costume, gave Keisha one last venomous look. Then, defeated, he walked off the bench and through the side door. Judge Sanchez took the bench. She looked at the chaos. She looked at Vance's empty table. She looked at Marcus Thorne. Then, her eyes settled on Keisha, who was still standing at the podium, breathing hard. "Well, Ms. Washington," Judge Sanchez said, a small, tired smile on her face. "It seems we have an opening. Please, finish. I'd like to hear the rest of your findings." The next 2 hours were a blur. With Judge Sanchez presiding and Marcus Thorne sitting at the counsel table, a silent, menacing, and deeply supportive presence, Keisha finished. She didn't just present the fraudulent air quality data. She had more. She had the real data, which she had commissioned herself with a grant from the Law Center. It showed that the projected particulate matter from the warehouse would increase asthma hospitalizations in the 19146 zip code by an estimated 30% within 5 years. She had internal memos, which she had gotten from a whistleblower inside Apex, a whistleblower her team had cultivated, that proved the company knew the Grays Ferry site was environmentally sensitive and that the Chester County data was a risk, but necessary for approval. She had, in short, a perfect, airtight, irrefutable case. When she was finished, she said, "And that, Your Honor, is why we are asking not just for the petition to be denied, but for the court to issue a permanent injunction against Apex Logistics from ever operating at this site." Judge Sanchez, a veteran of 1,000 such hearings, looked at the evidence. She looked at the empty petitioner's chair. She looked at Keisha. "Ms. Washington," she said, "this is the most thorough, professional, and devastating community impact presentation I have ever seen in 30 years on the bench." She raised her gavel. "Injunction granted. Petition denied with prejudice. This court will also be referring the matter of the fraudulent report to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office for criminal investigation. This hearing is adjourned." The courtroom exploded. Nana May was sobbing, shouting, "Amen, Jesus!" The small Grays Ferry contingent was on its feet, cheering, hugging. Keisha just stood there, her legs finally giving out. She sagged against the podium, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't hold the laser pointer. Marcus Thorne was at her side in an instant, a hand on her shoulder. "You're okay, kid," he said, his voice no longer a weapon but a balm. "You're okay. You did it." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By 3 p.m., the Philadelphia Inquirer had the story. A young reporter who had been in the back covering the boring zoning docket had just gotten the scoop of his career. Headline, "Grassroots Teen, Mocked by Judge, Exposes Multi-million-dollar Fraud in Philly Court." The story was electric. It had everything. A racist judge, a brilliant, young, black protagonist, A-list corporate lawyers, a poison-spewing corporation. By 5 p.m., King's English was trending on Twitter, and Judge Arthur Galloway was the most famous and most hated man in Philadelphia. The consequences were swift. Judge Galloway. The Judicial Conduct Board, facing a mountain of complaints, including one from Marcus Thorne and the office of the mayor, suspended him that afternoon. After a 3-month investigation, he was given a choice: resign immediately and forfeit his pension, or be publicly removed from the bench. He resigned. His portrait was quietly removed from the courthouse lobby. Apex Logistics. The criminal referral from Judge Sanchez was a death blow. The Attorney General's office indicted the company and 3 of its executives. Faced with the whistleblower's memos, they pled guilty. They were fined $50 million. Their stock plummeted. The entire Philadelphia branch was dissolved. Mr. Vance, the lawyer who had run, surrendered his law license 2 days later. Keisha. Keisha was a hero. She was on the cover of Philadelphia magazine, the voice that roared. She was on Good Morning America. She was offered not fellowships, but full-time jobs at every major law firm in the city. Deschert offered her a summer associate position, a role normally reserved for second-year law students, with a salary that made her eyes water. But the biggest ripple was one she hadn't expected. 6 months later, Keisha stood on a patch of cracked asphalt on 30th and Tasker. It was a cold, bright Saturday. This was the lot where the Apex warehouse was supposed to be. Today, it was full of people. Nana May was there, handing out cups of hot cider. Darius, his breathing easier in the crisp autumn air, was running around with a dozen other kids. Marcus Thorne was there, not in a Brioni suit, but in a UPenn hoodie and jeans, arguing with Dr. Castor about the Eagles. Keisha stood at a makeshift podium. Behind her was a large banner. Future home of the Darius Washington Community Green Space. After the Apex case, the city, in a massive public relations panic, had found the money to buy the land. They had turned it over to the Grays Ferry Community Coalition. Her coalition. Keisha tapped the microphone. The small crowd went quiet. "Hey, y'all," she said. Her voice, her real voice, amplified by the speakers, echoed across her neighborhood. "When I went to that courthouse," she said, "I was scared. I was scared they wouldn't listen to me. And at first, they didn't. Somebody told me my voice was gutter. Somebody told me I had to speak his language to be heard." She looked at Nana May, who was beaming. "But I was wrong. And he was wrong. See, this," she said, gesturing to the crowd, to the row houses, to the kids. "This is our language. It ain't gutter. It's the language of family. It's the language of hard work. It's the language of survival. And it's the language of truth. We ain't gotta learn their language," she said, her voice rising, the old preacher's cadence returning. "They gotta learn ours." The crowd roared. The Galloway incident, as it was now called, had forced a seismic shift. The Pennsylvania Bar Association, in partnership with the Public Interest Law Center, had instituted new, mandatory, cultural competency and bias training for every single judge in the state. And the first case study they used, the one that was required reading, was the full, unedited transcript of Case 3B901. Judge Galloway's words, his King's English speech, was now required reading for every new lawyer, a perfect example of what not to do. Keisha's final act had been the most powerful. She had taken the settlement money from her civil suit against Galloway, he'd settled fast, and used it to fund the new Keisha Washington Fellowship, a program at Penn Law dedicated to training community activists in the law, to teach them how to read the 800-page reports, to teach them how to find the lies, to teach them how to use the King's English as a weapon, while never, ever losing their own. She finished her speech, and Darius ran up and hugged her around the knees. She picked him up, and he breathed deep into her neck, his breath easy and clear. She had built a new door, and now she was holding it open for everyone else. That day in court, a judge thought his power was absolute. He thought he could use his robe to silence a voice he didn't understand. But Keisha Washington proved that true power isn't in the robe or the gavel. It's in the truth. It's in the work. And it's in the voice of the people, a voice that, once it finds its strength, can't be mocked, can't be silenced, and can change the world. Keisha didn't just win a case. She rebuilt a community and rewrote the rules. That's the incredible story of how one 19-year-old woman's courage turned a moment of public humiliation into a revolution. If you were inspired by Keisha's story, click like and subscribe for more true stories of real-life heroes who are changing the world. And let us know in the comments below, who is a hero in your community?